Hi, and welcome back to Vegas October 1 Sounds. It's been 2 months now since I made a video, and when last I left, I was working on audio analysis. Well, I've continued to work on audio analysis, and with primarily focusing on the single shot stuff, collecting information and finding out whether or not there was a possibility of snipers and things like that. I've reached no conclusion as of yet on that issue. I also continue to work on looking at the most recent released video, Close to Mandalay Bay, and I also took on a couple of other projects. One was to carefully analyze the gunshot sounds from the officers, and I made great progress on that, but I'm not ready to release any results. But here in the last month and a half, I've also been working with another YouTube presenter for Vegas, Hunter UK. And he and I have sort of been collaborating on looking at what the Lock Interrogation Report means. And for those who are not aware of it, the Lock Interrogation Report is part of the documentation that the police officers, LVMPD, put out. And what they did was they took a look at the locks on both of rooms 134 and 135, and they dumped the contents of those locks and the corresponding events that occur that are recorded on their system software and servers. And the basic phenomena is that every time something happens at those locks, open and closed, or somebody throws a deadbolt or something, it generates these little events which are sent to a server somewhere, which gets logged into a database. And then you can query that database and look at the results. And that's what they did for rooms 134 and 135, and they published it in the FIT report. And Hunter, who is an excellent presenter and a very detailed person, has for months and years maintained that the Lock Interrogation Report showed anomalies in the quote-unquote narrative. And so, being a detailed person that I am, and being the fact that he has this hardcore information that can be subject to rigorous analysis, he asked me if I'd be interested, and I said, sure, I'll take a look at this. And so I looked at his results, and I've always watched Hunter. I really like watching his stuff. But I've never really burned into my brain what he was talking about completely, because after all, audio analysis is far more than enough to keep my little brain going, and there's still massive amounts of things to be done on it. But I started looking carefully at the detailed work that he had done, and I said, okay, you've got something here. And so what we agreed on doing was to look at the Lock Interrogation Report and come up with a picture, and he's going to be doing some videos on this, come up with a storyboard of what was happening based upon that and other information. But for me at the moment, I was primarily focused on coming up to speed on this Lock Interrogation Report, because Hunter's had a couple of years now, and I've only had like a month. So what I did, being the software engineer that I am, is I took this report that was in paper form, and I basically did optical character recognition on it, which took me a couple of weeks, because the optical character recognition on it really didn't do it justice. But once I was done, I got a bunch of data and I put it into an Excel spreadsheet, and there was one page in my Excel sheet for every page that was in the report. And so now I have in hardcore text files that I can read, and I can use programs on to do data analysis with the Lock Interrogation Report. And so the question became then, what do I do with it? And that's a story. But the bottom line is that I've worked on that particular question for about a month now, and as I do with my other stuff, I produce data analysis, I produce charts, I produce whole bunches of stuff. Now, to look at the big picture on this, the question is the information that the LVMPD has released enough to determine whether or not their statements are true and accurate? And while we all know that there's big and massive problems with that, and even a superficial and cursory reading of the FIT report leaves you with this gurgling in your tummy, shall we say, because they aren't always precise and they aren't always accurate. But the big things, where was Paddock, what was he doing, was it even him, are, as far as I'm concerned, still up for grabs. Now, in terms of how many shooters was there, where I was and am and still a firm believer that there was simply one shooter doing all the shooting. The question of the snipers and all that, well, that's still out to lunch, and that's going to take some time to wrap up. But for over here, as people have bitched many times that I've only looked at audio analysis, I think that this excursion into the Lock Interrogation Report quite satisfies this concept. Now, from this analysis, will Hunter and I be able to say exactly what happened in terms of the shooting? No, the Lock Interrogation Report doesn't cover the actual shooting itself. It covers the events leading up to the shooting. And so, can we answer questions like how many people were involved? I think, there's some strong indications there. And can we answer questions of where was, Paddock and when? Yeah, we can answer some of those questions. And to do so, I want to introduce you now to an overview of what I've done with this. Now, bottom line, let me say that I have to date looked at, carefully examined, and concur with most, if not all, the statements that Hunter is asserting with regards to the results of the Lock Interrogation Report. That is, I agree and concur that the Lock Interrogation Report, after careful analysis, leaves only one conclusion, and that is that Paddock was not alone at a time shortly before he closed the doors and began the shooting, if indeed it was Paddock. So then, you have many questions to answer before you can just come out with wild-ass statements like that. But that is what I believe at this point in time, and barring further analysis, that's where I will remain. So that raises a whole new question. If somebody was there with Paddock, or whoever did the shooting, then what were they doing? When did they get involved? And why haven't we heard about them? And that's a fascinating question that, I don't know, maybe we can shed some light on it sometime. So without further ado, and to keep this video not too long, I'm going to give you a brief overview of what's been happening with the Lock Interrogation Report from my perspective. And of course, Hunter and I communicate regularly on this matter. So anyway, having once converted the Lock Interrogation Report from paper form into a hardcore data form, you end up with all the items Excel with a bunch of spreadsheets, and then you can look at it many different ways, and Hunter's done a fine job, and his Excel spreadsheet analysis is spot on. But not wanting to be brainwashed or duplicate his effort, I took a little bit different approach. I took all this stuff after it was brought to text, wrote a little program, and then I started looking at it from my perspective. And so what I did was I combined rooms 134, 135, put them all into one Excel spreadsheet, and then I started doing analysis of the data. And the typical analysis I would do is to break them up into regions of the time is the same. That is, these events occurred all in 1 minute, because the resolution of the Lock Interrogation Report is 1 minute. Yeah, that's right, 1 minute. And then what I do is look at the state of the doors, whether they were open or closed or bolted or unbolted, and what was going on in that regards. And so I built a little state machine. For those who aren't familiar with that phrase, it's a simulation of the two locks on the doors. That is, when you throw the bolt, the deadbolt is thrown, and to undo it, there's only two ways it can become undone. You physically turn the bolt back, or while it's deadbolted, you pull the handle, and the handle automatically releases the deadbolt. And both of those generate events, some which are uniquely identified by the combination of all these individual little events. And then we can look at the time gap between all those events. We can look at the frequency of events, blah, blah, blah. But more importantly, you can start to determine when people were and were not in the room. Now, there's ambiguity there. And so ultimately, with this data, I will take and run simulations on 1-person, 2-person, and 3-person involvements and see which model best fits the scenario. Now, we already know there was at least 2 people involved in the 9:33 p.m. time frame on the 1st of October. So it's at least 2 people, and there may be more, I don't know. But what I'll show you ultimately is where the one-person model fails and where the two-person model better explains. And there are multiple interpretations of this, even with the 1- and 2-person model, and I'll show you the results of that. And then Hunter and I, together and collectively, will come up with statements regarding the interpretation of those models as it applies against this Lock Interrogation Report. So, just as an example, the types of things that I do. Now, this is all a work in progress, so don't hold me accountable for the exact details here. Is I take those events, shall we say, and I augment them from the spreadsheet, and I augment them with the statements from the FIT report, and I come up with a timeline here. Now, this covers all the way from the 23rd to the 2nd, and there's lots of things missing in here. But this is just an example of what's happening. You take things like where he was or what the resources were for the rooms and Mesquite landfill and all that, and you plot it out. And you plot it out against, or I do anyway, this is a timeline, against what he was doing. So for example, here's one that comes directly from the FIT report called Close. This little orangish line here is a plot of when the door was closed for room 134, and as you can see, there's little variations in there. Now, that's not a very informative thing by itself, but when you plot it against, say, this purple region there, where it says gone, meaning somebody was gone from the room, then you can start to get an idea that there might be a problem there. Or there might not be a problem. Now, in this case, if we examine it more carefully on a finer scale, colors change, of course. Then here we have this gone region, and we look at it carefully, and it looks exactly like the door was closed while they were gone, and that's confirmation. And how I calculate gone is not the subject of this video. And then you can see these other things which I'm filling in up here, what he was doing, blah, blah, blah. And if we go down to a different region of the program. Let's see, this is combined. No, that's 134. Here we go. If I take all the events from that Lock Interrogation Report and I plot them again on a timeline corresponding to the days and hours of the report, and I break them down into the types of events they were and plot them on this scatter plot, it's called, you can begin to see patterns. And what you can see here is that, and if we go up one, we get a little bit better idea. This is an activity report. This is when events were being generated by the locks. And you can see there's some big gaps, and there's some small gaps, and then there's some regions of high activity. And of course, the high activity were corresponding to the region that was closest to the beginning of the shooting. Now, room 134 and 135 obviously were not all in use all the time, so take that into account. But from that, this is straight from the data. This is a simple little histogram plot of the events, the count of the events, and this is a breakdown of those events by their type. So we have closed, open, inside, release, thrown, read, air, whether or not cards were granted, whether or not there was attempt to get into a room while it was deadbolted. So here on that line we have, was there an attempt to get into the room while they were deadbolted? Yes, twice. Once on the 30th of September at 6:04, at least once, and again on the 30th at 2:07 p.m. And up here we can see the card rejects, and then here we can see the card accepts. That this is when a card was presented to the reader, and it was accepted, it was authorized, and over here you can see which card it was. So for example, if we take a look at paddock 4B, which is kind of hard to distinguish, it's kind of a light blue, and I'll improve these things. Alright, let's go with paddock 5A, because there's a 5A in there. Yeah, he had multiple cards. Here's a purple. So here we see a purple, and is that a purple there? Yep, that's paddock right there, or that's his card. Here's a card. There's another card. That belongs to a staff member. That's staff member. And so you can look at these things and start to get a big picture idea of what was happening, and then get an idea of the frequency and everything. And that'll help in looking at the big picture. And we can overlay these types of graphs with the fit report statements of what was happening, and we can find conflicts, or we can find supportive evidence, because some of the fit statements were taken directly out of the Lock Interrogation Reports. For example, there was a minibar serviced in room 1. Well, let's just say a minibar service in one of the rooms, and the fit report states precisely down to the minute when it was serviced, and that information comes directly out of the fit report. However, there was other information garnered from phones and whatnot that can be looked at when plotted against this information to confirm or reject the statements and or modify them. Because, for example, in one of the fit reports, and I'm sure many people who've listened to Hunter are familiar with this, that one night the fit report says that Paddock continuously gambled for lots of hours with no break, but yet the Lock Interrogation reports activity within the room. And so the question becomes, what was happening? Well, we will be reviewing that and coming up with a video and a documentation. Alright, so where does that leave us? Well, a lot of work to be done is where it leaves us. And ultimately, or I should say not ultimately, at the moment, I'm producing these kind of reports with lots and lots of state information and little analysis. And I do this analysis in 3 different ways. One is a casual analysis. That is, you look at it and you make notes and you make assertions and requirements and constraints upon the program to tell you what's happening. The other is a real formal analysis. That is, we can divide each of these time regions up into little state machines. We can describe precisely, the state of the locks as they went into those, and then we can assert, based upon that state and the information from the event, what was happening. So, for example, one example is right here, where I have a column that says hall, and that's a result of rigorous analysis that says somebody was in the hallway. Well, you say, well, that should be trivial, right? Well, yes and no. For example, if there's a door open and somebody presents their card and it gets accepted, are they in the hall or are they in the room? Interesting question. So the simple answer to that is then, if both doors are closed and they present a card, then they must be in the hall. Or similarly, if both doors are closed and there's an open from the inside, which is what that inside means, then somebody must be on the inside. And so then using that, let's find that. No. There we go, a second. I got lots of spreadsheets here. We can start to look at, in column I here, when there must have been somebody in the room, and when they may have entered, and when they may have exited, and the number of people that were required to get the job done. So that's the type of analysis. That's where I'll be going with this, explaining the details were interesting. Hunter and I will collectively, do videos that explain the results, and we hope to find a few interesting things. I believe we've already found a few interesting things, and I think Hunter is going to be covering that in the upcoming time. But anyway, that's it. That's Vegas October 1 sounds, and we'll grab you on the next one.